Breaking. Trump's EPA dismantles all U.S. climate regulations. What this means for America. Imagine a world where the very foundation of environmental regulations in the United States is suddenly upended. That's exactly what's happening as the Trump administration takes aim at a crucial health ruling that underpins all U.S. greenhouse gas regulations. This move, if finalized, would not only eliminate current limits on greenhouse gas pollution from vehicles, power plants, and other sources, but also significantly hinder future U.S. efforts to combat global warming. But here's where it gets controversial. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, claims this deregulatory action is the largest in U.S. history, potentially saving $54 billion annually by repealing all greenhouse gas standards. Environmental groups, however, are already gearing up for legal battles, predicting that this move will spell the end of U.S. action against climate change. The EPA's Administrator Lee Zeldin announced the plan to rescind the endangerment finding at a car dealership in Indiana, alongside Energy Secretary Chris Wright. This finding, which dates back to 2009 under President Barack Obama, established that greenhouse gas emissions endanger public health and welfare. The repeal of this finding would effectively remove the legal basis for all U.S. greenhouse gas regulations, a move that environmentalists argue will have dire consequences for the planet. Under President Joe Biden, the EPA had projected that tailpipe rules through 2032 would avoid more than 7 billion tons of carbon emissions, encouraging automakers to build more electric vehicles, EVs, and providing nearly $100 billion in annual net benefits to society. These benefits include reduced fuel costs, maintenance, and repair costs for drivers. However, Zeldin and Wright argue that the EPA does not have the authority to regulate greenhouse gases on its own, citing a 2024 Supreme Court decision that reduced the power of federal agencies to interpret the laws they administer, known as the Chevron deference. The endangerment finding was upheld in several legal challenges and has been the cornerstone of subsequent greenhouse gas regulations, including tailpipe standards for vehicles, carbon dioxide standards for aircraft, and methane standards for oil and gas operations. Zeldin and Wright, however, challenge the global scientific consensus on climate change, which indicates that global warming and its impacts are unfolding faster than expected. They also contradict the advisory opinion issued last week by the International Court of Justice, which stated that failure by governments to reduce emissions could be an internationally wrongful act, and that treaties such as the 2015 Paris Agreement on climate change should be considered legally binding. The administration has already dismissed all authors of the U.S. Trump's EPA proposes repealing climate change regulations. What you need to know. Imagine a scenario where the very tools designed to combat climate change are being systematically dismantled. This is the current trajectory under the Trump-era EPA, which appears to be undermining its own authority to address one of the most pressing issues of our time. But here's where it gets controversial. The move to revoke the foundational endangerment finding could drastically weaken the federal government's ability to regulate greenhouse gases, potentially setting back climate action by decades. Back in 2009, the Environmental Protection Agency officially recognized that the increasing levels of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere posed a serious threat to public health and welfare. This declaration, known in legal circles as the endangerment finding, was a pivotal moment. To many who had followed climate science for years, it seemed obvious, yet its implications for U.S. policy were profound. It granted the EPA the authority to impose regulations on emissions from vehicles, power plants, and various industrial sources. While these rules have faced legal challenges and political shifts, the core authority they rely on has remained surprisingly resilient. Fast forward to this week, and the Trump administration's EPA has taken a bold step toward reversing this critical legal foundation. At a dealership in Indianapolis, EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin announced a formal proposal to rescind the 2009 endangerment finding, a move that has been in the works since Trump's second term began. Simultaneously, Zeldin revealed plans to eliminate all federal regulations targeting greenhouse gas emissions from motor vehicles. He boldly claimed that if these changes are finalized, it would be the largest deregulatory action in U.S. history. Zeldin criticized previous EPA administrations, suggesting that their 2009 declaration was based on many mental leaps. He argued that the real threat to Americans isn't carbon dioxide itself, but the regulations that limit emissions, which he claims drive up prices and restrict consumer choices. But here's the catch. If the EPA succeeds in overturning the endangerment finding, it would effectively wipe out the most powerful regulatory tool the federal government has to combat climate change, according to Ann Carlson, an environmental law expert at UCLA. Meanwhile, Republicans in Congress have already rolled back significant parts of President Biden's ambitious climate legislation, which aimed to meet international climate commitments by investing heavily in renewable energy. Now, by targeting the endangerment finding, they are attacking the other main lever, executive regulatory authority to limit emissions. In essence, they've already removed many of the carrots, incentives and subsidies, and now they're going after the sticks. The regulatory powers. Patrick Parenteau, a seasoned professor of climate policy, warns that without this legal foundation, the U.S. will lack a serious national climate strategy. But here's the twist. Experts believe that the EPA's plan is likely to face years of legal battles, possibly reaching the Supreme Court, which previously upheld the agency's authority to regulate greenhouse gases in 2007. Even if the courts eventually allow the EPA to overturn the finding, the process could be lengthy and fraught with political and legal hurdles. Adding complexity, the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act explicitly reaffirmed the EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, under the Clean Air Act, an amendment that Republicans did not repeal. This legal safeguard could be invoked in court to challenge the EPA's efforts, making the legal landscape even more complicated. And if the case reaches the Supreme Court, there's a real possibility that the conservative majority might revisit the landmark 2007 decision, Massachusetts v. EPA, which established the EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gases. Such a move could effectively block future climate regulations, leaving the U.S. without a clear federal approach. The implications extend beyond regulation. If the endangerment finding is revoked, it could weaken the legal defenses of oil companies in climate lawsuits brought by cities and states. Historically, courts have ruled that because the EPA was already regulating emissions, states couldn't sue polluters under federal nuisance laws. But without the EPA's regulatory authority, that legal shield could crumble, exposing fossil fuel companies to a wave of lawsuits. Furthermore, reversing the finding could lead to a patchwork of state-level regulations. This could create chaos in the legal and regulatory landscape, complicating efforts to address climate change uniformly across the country. For example, California might push ahead with its own stricter vehicle emission standards, challenging federal authority and potentially igniting legal battles. And what if a future administration, more progressive and climate-friendly, decides to reinstate the endangerment finding? While technically possible, do you believe that revoking the endangerment finding will truly serve economic interests? Or does it threaten the very foundation of climate policy in the United States? Share your thoughts below. This is a conversation that's far from over. Trump's shocking climate rule repeal, what it means for U.S. environmental policy. Imagine a world where the very rules designed to protect our planet from the growing threat of climate change are suddenly stripped away. That's exactly what some believe is happening with a bold move by the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. The EPA, under new leadership, has announced its intention to dismantle a historic regulation that has been central to addressing greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. But here's where it gets controversial. This decision could reshape how we approach environmental protection for decades to come. At the heart of this debate lies the endangerment finding, a pivotal 2009 ruling that declared greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and hydrofluorocarbons pose a significant threat to both public health and welfare. This conclusion wasn't reached lightly. It was based on an exhaustive analysis spanning nearly 200 pages and incorporating over 380,000 public comments. These findings laid the groundwork for federal regulations aimed at curbing emissions from vehicles, power plants, and other major contributors to climate change. Fast forward to today, and the EPA, now led by Administrator Lee Zeldin, appointed by former President Donald Trump, is taking steps to repeal this landmark decision. Zeldin argues that the agency overstepped its legal authority when it determined that greenhouse gases endanger public health. Speaking at an event in Indiana alongside Governor Mike Braun and Energy Secretary Chris Wright, Zeldin claimed that the original endangerment finding made overly pessimistic predictions about climate science that ultimately didn't hold true. He described the potential repeal as the largest deregulatory action in the history of the United States, framing it as a necessary step to rein in what he sees as unauthorized regulatory power. But not everyone agrees. Critics argue that this move lacks both scientific merit and legal justification. They warn that repealing the endangerment finding could undo years of progress in combating climate change and leave future generations more vulnerable to its devastating effects. For instance, the Sierra Club has already signaled its intent to explore all legal avenues, including litigation, to challenge the decision. Lauren Blackford, the organization's acting executive director, stated, if approved, rescinding the endangerment finding would deal a fatal blow to the EPA's ability to regulate harmful greenhouse gas emissions and safeguard our communities. Adding fuel to the fire, environmental lawyer Mike Gerard, who founded Columbia University's Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, views this as another chapter in the ongoing battle against climate regulations. While he notes that the immediate impact might be limited since many of the affected policies are already being scaled back, he predicts that lawsuits will inevitably follow. In fact, experts like Joe Goffman, a former EPA official during the Biden administration, suggests that this could lead to a Supreme Court showdown, a court whose composition has shifted significantly since the 2007 ruling that first allowed the EPA to regulate greenhouse gases. And this is the part most people miss. The scientific consensus on climate change has only grown stronger since the endangerment finding was first established. A 2021 study published in Nature Climate Change revealed that human-amplified climate change contributed to 37% of heat-related deaths between 1991 and 2018. Meanwhile, the Fifth National Climate Assessment warns that unchecked climate changes threaten everything from safe housing and reliable public services to thriving ecosystems and cultural traditions. So, what happens next? The public will have the chance to weigh in on the proposed rule before it becomes final, and lawsuits could delay implementation even further. Historically, courts have rejected attempts to overturn the endangerment finding on legal grounds. But will this time be different? Is the EPA truly overstepping its bounds? Or is this a dangerous step backward in the fight against climate change? We want to hear your thoughts. Do you think repealing the endangerment finding is justified, Or does it represent a betrayal of environmental responsibility? Share your opinions in the comments below.